have gone through that experience, you have a continuing interest in what is found out later. I think we have at least 2 shelves in our bookcases of stories about or written by people who were in Nuremberg. And we both read them with interest and learn new things. And I'm sure it has, I never had thought of it very much. But.
Last question. Has it ever left your thoughts over the years, or was Nuremberg always in the back of your mind, even as you were points in the 60s and 70s?
I think it's been in the back of my mind. I was telling Greg earlier that I've been involved as a lobbyist in the field of mental health and mental retardation. And there was a time when there were some pretty awful experiments being carried out in the state hospitals and the state home for the retarded in many of the states, Pennsylvania for one. And I was very much aware, and through the mental health associations and the the retarded people, our lawyers, when we were trying to focus on these experiments, we went back, or at least I did, I said, this is what was being done in the concentration camps. You can't do that in our state hospital. Some of the first people that Hitler put in concentration camps before the war started were the mentally retarded and the mentally ill. Those were the main inmates at that time. They weren't being exterminated at that point. Well, I think some of them were. I've read different accounts of that, and I'm not sure what it's accurate.
It's a great segue. One of these articles on the Nazi physicians talked about the experimentation regarding euthanasia. And they talked about the Nazis based their justification for medical killing on the concept of life unworthy of life. Mm-hmm. And they talk about a particular book involved. And the author is identified as unworthy the incurably ill, as well as large mm-hmm. segments of the mentally ill, retarded, or feeble-minded, and deformed adults and children.
Yeah.
They professionalized and medicalized the concept and stressed the therapeutic goal. It was left to the Nazis to invest unworthy life with their own ideology and to carry it to its ultimate biological, racial, and therapeutic extreme. Mental hospitals became an important focus for the development of euthanasia consciousness. And that kind of goes on from there, but I'm sure that was part of the experimentation when Jack was a part.
Yeah.
And as we were talking today in the car, there may be a linkage there.
Yeah, well, I think there's probably, we have to be vigilant about people in authoritative places, how they carry out what they see as their duty, and be sure that what they're approving of is a legitimate thing to be doing.
I'm switching gears here. Personally, you need to know this, that Jack proposed to Hilda on their very first date. He made us all, for us, the rest of us guys, it took a long time to figure out, to find the right woman. That must have, just personally, that must have taken you by surprise.
Oh, it did. I knew his brother, and I knew his mother and father, not very well, but they went to the Methodist church where I went when I was in school, and as Jack said, they had a mom and pop store that was not too far off the campus where sometimes I would stop and buy apples and what have you. So, but it was a slight, it wasn't a very, I guess I knew Jack more through the fact that one of my debate colleagues was the girl that he had gone with and that he left behind when he went to Columbia, you see. So she was always talking about Jack Robbins. But after a year or two, all that tapered off, and I didn't hear much more about him after that until he came, but even by the time he got there. And when I went in to tell Dr. McConnell, who was president of the college, that I had decided to get married and I wanted to be relieved of my teaching, of what little I was doing while I was studying. And he said, well, you know, I thought you were going to be here for several years. And I said, well, I thought so too. He said, finally, he said, well, who is this you're marrying? And I said, Jack Robbins. He said, oh, why didn't you tell me that? That's all right, go ahead. Because Jack had been a debater and was quite a name on the campus when he was there.
Oh, that's terrific. Were you glad to leave Nuremberg?
Yes, by that time I was about 3 months or so pregnant, and I wasn't getting very good medical care at the Army hospital, and so I was plenty glad to start home. We went over on a troop ship, and we came back on a troop ship, but fortunately there were some nurses on there, and they were very helpful because I was upchucking. I was very sick. I had upchucked on the way over because I was seasick, but on the way back it was because I was pregnant.
What's your reflections on Nuremberg? What is the legacy? You're a voracious reader. You've read an awful lot. Your husband was, and you were intimately involved in the process.
Well, you know, that term that was used in the indictments called crimes against humanity, I think if we know that such crimes can be committed, but they can also be prevented if we keep our eye on keeping our newspapers and television reporters and all of that as honest and as level-based as we can in presenting the news that is developing. And, you know, little news, not little news, but what might seem insignificant in some small town in South Dakota, but it could have implications. The way they were, the way the defendant was treated could have implications. And I contribute and support and receive a lot of information from an organization called the Southern Poverty Law. What is the last word? You're probably familiar with it.
Right.
Yeah. And their sole purpose is trying to identify hate groups. And wherever there is a church that's gets a swastika on it or a cross burned, and it is absolutely shocking how many hate groups there are across the country. And now with the use of computers, it just generates more and more and more. And I guess it's every 2 months they send you a report with a map of the United States that has a point where any hate group has been identified and they've brought cases against a number of situations. And I was telling someone not long ago that there are these terrorists that are right here among us spreading hate. They're one of the main groups, you know. I mean, there's part of them that's against or promoting the idea that there was no such thing as concentration camps or Holocaust. And it's frightening to think how many, when I get that report from the Southern Poverty Law, whatever it is, that these things are going on. You don't hear much about them, but they're there, and we have to be vigilant that we try to keep them in a legal way under control.
When you were touring around with Jack and Telford Taylor, and you go into your first concentration camp,
Yeah.
you open the gates and you walk in, what was your reaction?
Oh, and they did it step by step. You know, this is where they came in, and this is where they pulled off their clothes, and this is where they went in to get the gas. And so it was just, I couldn't believe it. It was hard to believe it. At that time, they didn't have it quite as organized as they did when we went back, I don't know, half a dozen years after that, maybe more. By that time, they had all of these big bundles of hair, or here were all the shoes that had been collected, and another place, here was the gold that was extracted from teeth before they would go in to be gassed. And they had that set up so you could see it, and that was almost a double shock, seeing the way it was, by that time, had been brought together. It's hard to believe. It really is. It's just hard to believe that human beings can be led to the kind of belief that saturated Germany, because they didn't have those kind of beliefs in the early 20s, and in a relatively short period of time, through the propaganda that was put out about Jews, and they could just, the whole intelligent, college-going, well-educated population was led to believe all of these things that a rational mind just couldn't believe.
Your husband's a very humble guy, and in the interview he was very humble. Yet he was in an active participant in all 12 trials, and certainly a very principal one on at least 2 of them.
Mm-hmm.
As an observer of Jack's role in Nuremberg, what really was it?
He was very. He was not high pitched, or he was low key, like you see him here. And he was. He depended a lot on these statistics that, as he said, were so you couldn't question them. They were the Nazi, and he would lay that out. I do remember one time that something that he had said, was it he or was it his person in the chair, the witness, that got misinterpreted, translated, that is, because simultaneous translations. And consequently, it must have been a misinterpretation or mistranslation of what he had said, because the witness became very agitated, and Jack couldn't understand, and he was trying to sort of calm this down, and then he asked the translator to repeat what he had said, and this time it came out accurate. I don't remember the whole thing, but I do remember that little incident, and I happened to be there and saw him. But he didn't bluster. He didn't shout. He depended on his. He knew what he had collected in the way of evidence, and he just presented it. And well, you know, we were talking earlier about the fact that Jackson was such a marvelous writer. And I think one of the things that Telford appreciated about Jack and used Jack was a lot in preparing opening statements and things like that. He could put together in a logical order without too much falderall. He's not a great user of adverbs and adjectives like I am when I'm writing, but he just gives it to you, but he does it in a very good way. Yeah.
Did he bring the case home at night?
Somewhat, but not a lot. And when we could, we would go on the weekends to down to Birch's Garden. We learned how to ski down there. And then we finally learned that the train that came through Nuremberg late in the afternoon on Fridays went directly to Prague. And on several weekends, we would get that train and ride sitting up most of the night. And then when we got to Prague, we were seeing it for the first time, and eventually we got pretty well acquainted. And I remember one time we asked a person about going fishing, and he turned out to be the commissioner of fishing, and he closed the office and took us with his equipment and everything. It was just that little window when Czechoslovakia was out from under the Germans and before the Russians had moved in, and they just welcomed the Americans so much, and they would call out to you, they would call out and say, Roosevelt, and they had pictures of Roosevelt in their windows and things like that. And so it was a delightful place to visit because they were so friendly and welcoming.
What was the highlight of your stay in Nuremberg?
The highlight. Oh, it's kind of hard for me to identify. I don't think anybody ever asked me that before. I was full of pride when Jack was doing his work and being the one that was presenting or cross-examining and that kind of thing, because he was good at that, and he liked doing it too. And I think it was when Jack was being active that was my. Another thing that Jack kept saying, I wish I had a Wigmore on evidence. And I didn't know what a Wigmore, particularly since he used the word a. He said, well, I wish I had a Wigmore on evidence. And I finally discovered that these were some law books. So I wrote to a friend of ours who was still in law school at Columbia and told him to send whatever this meant. Well, he sent a whole, I don't know how many volumes, big volumes, of Wigmore on evidence. And they were added to the very limited law library, if you could call it that. But he enjoyed having those, the other lawyers, and interestingly enough, the defense lawyers, most of whom spoke and read English, they came in and were using these books also. So I enjoyed that. I think that was one of my highlights, seeing how pleased he was, and it did surprise him. He didn't know that I had written and asked for these to be sent.
Yeah, that's terrific. Was there during that 18 months you were there, was there a low time where you said, geez, I want to get out of here?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, there was a period when I became a little depressed. I didn't know what it was at that time. Later in my life, I know that I have a unipolar depression. And I was really depressed, and I was pushing myself every day to go into the courthouse. And as I say, it was the first time I'd ever had, well, I know now, looking back, I had some periods even before that in college, but not much was known about depression in those days. And so I really did. And I remember I wrote my father one time and asked him, of all things, to send me some Fritos. I just thought somehow that was something when I was depressed that would make me feel better. And he included those in a package of stuff, and he sent, it was just before Christmas, so it had some Christmas things in it, and he put in some mistletoe, and that was very, I don't know, it just made me feel more like I was having a real Christmas, the fact that there was some mistletoe, just the way we used to have it at home.
Sure.
Yeah.
So when Jack finally announces that you guys are heading back, I assume you're kind of jubilation. Did you know
Yeah.
the time periods?
Not exactly, because it sort of depended on, he wanted to wind up what he had, and we did have a little time. It seemed to me it must have been, though, before the very end, because I remember getting packed up, and not that there was much to pack, but we went to Venice. We hadn't been there, and I was in that period of my pregnancy where I just wanted to sleep all the time. We'd go to places and I would fall asleep. But we had just that little time. Oh, one time, I'll have to tell you this joke on me. As I say, I got pretty good at this bargaining with cigarettes and so forth, and exchanging money in other countries. And one time I went to Athens. They were sending the plane down to pick up some witnesses, and they were going down and get the witnesses, and then the next day they were going to come back with them, and I could come back. So I went down, and I had these American dollars, and I knew what Jack did when we went to France or something like that. He would go around the corner with somebody and change these, not in the bank, of course. So I showed my American dollars to somebody, and I got all of this paper. And when I got back to the hotel, I was showing the pilot. I said, "Boy, I think I got a really good exchange. I don't know what you're supposed to get." And he looked at what I had. He said, "If you don't win the lottery, there'll be something wrong with it." I had bought lottery tickets. Now, that's how dumb I was. I was. Oh, but that plane didn't come back for 3 days. And so I had a good bit of time to see my way around Athens. And the thing that I remember, there were no young children, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old children. And it wasn't until I probably was back home and reading something that I read about how the Nazis took all of the milk and cheese and all of the nutrients that they could have, and that consequently in several of the occupied countries there were no little children because they were just starved. The families wouldn't have enough to eat, and the children couldn't survive on those. I didn't realize that that was something that wasn't in Nuremberg but was happening, in Belgium and Greece and places like that. So it does keep haunting you. Well, it does.
You've been terrific.
Well, thank you, Greg. You're a good interviewer. I think you are, and obviously you've done a lot of homework and knew these trials very
I don't know
well.
about that, but I'm learning every day. That's the beauty of it. Every day is a new adventure, and to have the chance to meet you folks is a highlight. And
It's certainly nice to be invited. I'm enjoying being here.
our next stop is to have a little lunch before we put Jack on center stage.
It was a great privilege and honor for us both to be at the Robert H. Jackson Center. All of the lawyers in Nuremberg, and there were about 100 of them that participated in the trials that followed Jackson's prosecution of Herman Goering and Hess and Ribbentrop and so forth. And it's also, I have to say, a great privilege to be here with Elder Hostel people. Hilda and I have done lots of traveling with Elder Hostel. We've tried, I'm sorry to say that Elder Hostel is cutting back on its homestay programs, but we've tried to go on homestay trips, and we've really enjoyed those, and we've told so many people that the travelers with Elder Hostel are such good travelers. They're on time and they don't complain, and they know that, well, they've come to learn. And so
We have traveled overseas with Elder Hostel.
Hilda, you want to pick up the microphone?
We keep telling people that we're going to do overseas traveling with Elder Hostel, and then when we get
great honor to be there this morning and talk to them about the Nuremberg war crimes trials. As Roland said, I worked on practically all of the 12 cases because I went over to Nuremberg as General Taylor's legal aid, and as such I helped him draft the indictments in the 12 cases, and I traveled with him throughout Europe, interviewing prospective witnesses and collecting documentary evidence. Incidentally, the prosecution used 80% of its case in documents that were created by the German defendants. They were great record keepers, and they indicted themselves with the documents that they created. Do you want to say anything about any of the Hilda?
Hey, Jack, can I ask a question? I think they might be interested to know that you had an opportunity to interview Hermann Gehry, and since he seems to be a known defendant, give your reaction of what he was all about.
Yes, in preparing for the case, United States against Oswald Pohl, the concentration camp case, the defendants were 18 SS generals and colonels that were in charge of the administration of the concentration camps. In preparation for that, I obtained permission to take Goering's testimony. You know, he was head of the German Air Force and second in command behind Hitler after Hess. And I took his testimony, and I recall that when he entered the chamber, he clicked his heels and he assumed that he was in charge of the whole proceedings. This was just a few days before the court handed down its verdict, and you remember that, I guess it was in October 1946 that he committed suicide just before he was to be hanged. He had, when I interviewed him before the trials, he had lost a lot of weight. He had weighed almost 300 pounds. He was down to 170 some odd. And his military uniform, which had been stripped of insignia, of course, hung on him like a gunny sack. He was
available quite widely of the concentration camps. And there was one point in one of Jack's trials where he was going to use those pictures. And we took the woman who was our cook and housekeeper. We had been billeted in a house that had belonged to former Nazi parties, and she was a member of the Nazi party. She was a teacher. We took her to the trials to see these, and when we got out, you know, I said, well, Maria, what is your reaction to this? She said, I don't think we did any of that. Said, I don't believe that we had people going into slave labor camps, and I don't believe that people were exterminated. And I said, when you saw those pictures that were taken when the army went into these places, and she said, I don't know where they got those pictures. And she said, my father was a well-known architect, and he knew all of the buildings, the important buildings that were being built in Germany, and he didn't have anything to do with building any concentration camps or anything like that. And that was it was just unbelievable that
The denial.
the denial and the fact that Hitler was able to lead a whole population of educated people into believing on his philosophy, the Nazification. It's still hard to believe because, you know, he did all of this within about a 10-year period. The people back in the 1920s, they didn't have any thing against the Jews or the gypsies or the feeble-minded, and he so convinced the populace that those people had to be eliminated and the Germans had to become the superior race. And that led to all of his conquering so many countries that he conquered. And what happened in Germany, it's still, after all these years, it's hard for me to believe.
Just a real quick question. I know that everybody wants a Nazi, but you had to actually join the party, et cetera, right? So, were all of the people there, did you get the impression, or was it your feeling that all of the people...
In Germany under Hitler, and it was an eliminationist philosophy that the Jews and the gypsies and the communists had to be exterminated. They were treated like vermin. I recall that Dr. Klein in the medical case was asked on cross-examination how he could square the smoking chimneys of Auschwitz with his Hippocratic oath. And he said, well, it's simple. He said, as a physician, it would be my job to eliminate any extermination, any, what was the adjective he used? But his point was that eliminating Jews and gypsies was just like eliminating vermin. And
It was a purification sort of thing.
I think this morning you said, you sort of said that a doctor's supposed to eliminate disease and invasive infection, and the Jews are an invasive infection, or something like that.
it was a deep-seated anti-Semitism that I think led to the excesses and the cruelties and the unbelievable cruelties that place in the concentration camps, and 10 million Jews were killed.
Jack, you brought up something today which I failed to interview you about, and that was your relationship or your time with Roman Rudenko, who was the chief prosecutor for the Russians,
Yeah.
of which I got the sense everybody in Nuremberg knew very little about what they were even doing, as far as evidence, strategies, etc. Talk to us a little bit about Rudenko, because he's such a key figure.
Yeah, in 1970, which was, I don't know, 20 years after we left Nuremberg, we traveled to Moscow, and I wrote ahead of time to General Rudenko and told him that we were coming to Moscow, and I didn't hear from him in response, but when we arrived at the airport, there was a military guard there to greet us, and they really rolled out the red carpet, and they took us to the Russia Hotel, where we had dinner with General Roman Rudenko, who was had returned to Moscow and to his position as Attorney General of Russia.
And he brought his, as an interpreter, the same woman who had been in Nuremberg as one of the interpreters. So she knew about what we were discussing.
And he, in that 2-hour dinner, it was spent almost entirely on his zealous campaign to find Nazi war criminals, and that was 20 years after Nuremberg. And he was a very likable person. We had sturgeon, caviar, and vodka at top of the Russia Hotel, and it was interesting that even then, 20 years after, of course, the United States also has had a similar program. I've forgotten the fellow's name in the Justice Department, who has the job of tracking down war criminals, and every once in a while you read about in the paper somebody being deported who was a concentration camp guard and who falsified his papers in entering the United States.
Can you tell us about a few of your most memorable experiences during trials?
Well, I guess the most gruesome was the trial of the Einsatzgruppen. That was the group of SS people who followed the German army into Russia, and it was their job to kill outright Jews and gypsies and communists. Otto Ohlendorf, who was head of, he was an SS general, who was head of one of the Einsatzgruppen D. He admitted that he was personally responsible for killing 90,000 Jews, and the entire Einsatzgruppen was responsible for killing about 1 million. Evidence like that was pretty dramatic. And of course, the evidence of medical experimentation was pretty gruesome too, because the doctors in the concentration camps, the concentration camps couldn't run without a big medical contingent. You know, they were standing on the ramps when inmates came in and made the decision between those who were to live temporarily to work in the mines and the quarries, and those who were to be killed immediately. And the medical experiments were particularly horrendous.
Were they all executed, or what was the range of sentences?
I'm sorry?
Were they all executed for these deeds?
No, of the, I think it was 18 defendants in the whole case, and 24 in the medical doctor's case. In the doctor's case, I think there were 7 defendants who were convicted and hanged, and 4 in the Pohl case received death sentences. Something like 14 in the Einsatzgruppen case. But in every one of those cases, except the Einsatzgruppen case, there were a number of acquittals. And the court in those cases, I think there were 4 in the medical case and an equal number in the Pohl case who were acquitted. The court found that we had not presented sufficient evidence for conviction. And one thing that the courts were very insistent upon was the presumption of innocence and the requirement on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt the alleged guilt. And the defendants had exemplary rights. They had the right of crossing to be represented by the very best lawyers in Germany. They had the right of cross-examination, and they had the right to use the U.S. military to find witnesses for them, and they had the right to receive the documentary evidence that we were going to present in court. So the fact that quite a number of defendants were acquitted, I think, shows that the courts, in all 12 cases, were quite fair and balanced and objective.
Who made up the court or the jury?
I'm sorry?
Who made up the court or the jury?
The court was made up of 3 state court judges and 1 alternate. There was not a jury. And in each case, the court wrote an extensive opinion about the guilt or innocence of the defendants, describing in each case the evidence and or the lack of evidence.
My husband and I had the opportunity to go to Dachau. So we went through that museum and we saw all those horrendous things that those doctors had done.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if during the trial, did you see any remorse, regret? Did you have the feeling that any of them were doing what they were doing because they were ordered to do it, or?
A good many of them pled superior orders and the defense that they were required to do what they did. But the court held that superior orders is not a defense. That is the so-called Nuremberg defense. One of the principles that came out of the decisions. The courts held that superior orders could be pled as a mitigating circumstance, but is not a complete defense in any case. And, a lot of the atrocities were so horrible that just as some of the treatment of prisoners in Iraq today are so horrible that the defense of superior orders just is ridiculous. I mean,
Angelo was not there.
no, he was not apprehended at the time, so he was not tried, and I think there was only one person, and that was in the first big case, that was tried in absentia, and I think that was Martin Borman. And in none of the 12 subsequent cases was anyone tried in absentia, and Mengele was not one of the defendants.
You said there were 3 judges that involved. Where were they from?
They were from all over the country. I recall that in the medical case, the presiding judge was a judge, chief judge from the state of Washington, and another judge was from the Supreme Court of Florida, and the third judge, I've forgotten where the other 2 judges.
They were all American?
They were all American judges.
What is the British and Russian?
Well, the British carried on the trials in the British zone. Nuremberg happened to be in the American zone, and the American cases were tried in Nuremberg. The French tried cases in the French zone, and the Russians tried cases in Moscow. So there were cases being tried in parallel in the French zone and in the English zone.
Not the same position.
Not the same defendants, different defendants. We had an exchange of defendants. We traded some potential defendants to England and to France and to Russia and received in exchange the defendants to put in the dock in the medical case and the whole case.
How did you feel about the press coverage of the Nuremberg trials? Did you think that what happened there was widely known in the United States, in Europe?
We didn't have any first-hand knowledge of that. We had a second-hand knowledge, and we received excerpts from the New York Times, and they seemed to be pretty well balanced and complete. Yeah.
Do you know what has happened to the results of the findings of these medical experiments? Has that evidence been destroyed? Is it classified? Is it public?
That's a very good question. And let me tell you about the one thing that has come out of the medical case, and that is the so-called Nuremberg doctrine on experimentation. And there were 10 principles that the court enunciated. I'm not going to go over all of them, but these are important, and up until this decision, these were not widely accepted principles at all. But since that time, they have been followed pretty much consistently throughout the world. Number 1 principle was the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint and so forth. 2, the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society. 3, the experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study, that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. 4, the experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury, and so forth. So it's the voluntary and informed consent has become a touchstone for human experimentation.
If I could add a point, recently, actually about a couple years ago, we had Michael Berenbaum, who was the curator of the Holocaust Museum in Washington in the Jackson Center, and we interviewed him. And I asked him, I said, what does Robert Jackson and the Nuremberg trials mean to the Holocaust movement? And he allowed us out, one, the documentation for all time that, in fact, the Holocaust occurred, and for that they tipped the hat to Jackson for making those decisions at the Nuremberg trial, which is something which will preclude anybody denying the Holocaust, at least certainly effectively. And the second thing, and he said just as important, is that what you've just talked about, Jack, the concept of informed consent, which is a concept which we all live with on a daily basis, and for the first time enunciated at a Nuremberg trial of which you were a prosecutor. Just to kind of put things in a framework, folks, Jack Robbins, who you're hearing here today, is a major player in an event which occurred, which led to a judgment which we all live with today.
But we had nothing to do with that thing that was inaugurated or put into effect about a year ago, where you have to sign. You know, everybody who's been to a doctor since then knows what I'm talking about. But that is said in jest. But basically, that's the kind of thing that was established at Nuremberg, that before anything can be done to you, they have to have your consent. So
It really has been carried to a ridiculous extreme.
Was there any worthwhile, useful information gained from the experiment with German?
You know, that's a good question. Justice Masmano, in his concurring opinion in the Pohl case, said there's not one single scintilla of evidence of anything of any importance, either in curing or preventing disease or injury. And he points out that, for example, at Dachau, the doctors amputated limbs of mentally defective people, amputated them at the hip, for the purpose of finding out whether the amputation of the leg would help them mentally.
Did any of the doctors offer any justification for the experiment? In their
they, I think, all relied on superior orders that they were required by superior officers to do what they did. I don't think any one of them claimed that the experiments were harmless. The evidence was so overwhelming on that score. I think superior orders was about the only thing, a justification that they gave.
Did you state how many doctors were prosecuted?
Let me just hold that. Let me get that exactly.
heavy man wrote the judgment at Nuremberg.
Yeah, and a play based on the movie opened on Broadway about 2 years ago. We went over to Philadelphia to see it, and I thought that was good, but I think the movie was even better.
Was it faithful to the
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
What was it like living in Germany at that time, and how were the German people adjusting to their idealistic vision that Hitler had, and then seeing the whole world exposing that as the evil thing that it was?
Well, I'll let Hilda talk about it, but Nuremberg and all of Germany was very badly destroyed by bombing. Nuremberg is just a city of rubble, and the courthouse in the so-called Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was chosen because even though it was pretty badly destroyed, it was the only building in Germany that could be used as a trial of the magnitude that was anticipated. So living in Germany at the time, we really, well, fraternization with the Germans was prohibited. So we pretty much lived with the American army that was there. And I don't know, do you want to say anything about it?
Thanks for letting me talk about this. Well, we were furnished, or given a house that had
Petitioned the Supreme Court on behalf of defendants. And I replied that I felt that was a conflict of interest, that I couldn't comply with that. But the answer is no, I didn't have it. Yes.
I understand that there was a practice of the American military commanders forcing local residents to go through those camps to see the horrible situations there. How widespread was that throughout Germany that they were forced to do that?
I think it was pretty widespread. And you know, there were literally thousands. Most people don't realize there were thousands of concentration camps in Germany and the occupied territories. And I think that practice was fairly widespread. Well, we've been talking for an hour or a little more. A couple more questions, and I think we probably ought to let you go to dinner.
How would they decide who would be trying which?
Express anything like remorse?
I don't think Spear said after he was convicted and he received a life sentence, which he was really very lucky to get, I think. He said that the trials were fair and necessary. I think that's about the only case that I can think of where anyone expressed any doubt about the rightness of their actions. It's hard to believe, but I think that's the case. Yeah.
I wonder if there was any coordination or agreement about the standards for the trials between the different countries involved.